All right, welcome everybody. Thank you guys for coming to another Authors at Google Talk with the one and only Steve Hindy, co-founder and president of Brooklyn Brewery. His new book, The Craft Beer Revolution, tells a story about how craft brewers joined forces to forever change the world, the way the world buys, enjoys, and appreciates beer. As one of the founding players in the movement, Hindy brings a true insider's account of the personalities, battles, and alliances that colored the early days of craft beer. So now I want to read you a paragraph that made me actually laugh out loud and shows why I like the book so much, and I think you guys should grab it. The setup is Paul Shipman, the co-founder of what became Red Hook, was telling a story to Peter Krebs for his book. Is Krebs right? Red Hook, beer pioneer, when he hilariously said this. "We inspired people to become microbrewers," Shipman claimed to Krebs, "because every homebrewer who tasted our beer thought they could make better beer in the bathtub. They were thinking that if Red Hook could be this successful with the beer that tasted this odd, just think of what they could do with a good tasting beer." So that's one of the reasons I think you should pick it up. If you're still not sure, the book has praise from the founders of Anchor, New Belgium, Sam Adams, Dogfish Head, Sierra Nevada, Deschutes, and even the CEOs of Miller Coors and Heineken. Sam Calione, founder of Dogfish Head, said, "Balance, it's a desired trait in the brewery world. That perfectly comforting zone created through the interplay of hops and barley. Steve Hindy has found the equivalent space as a beer journalist / brewing pioneer in his book, The Craft Beer Revolution." So here he is, Steve Hindy.
Thank you, Caleb. Well, great to be here talking about my new book. Which is actually my second book. The first book is called Beer School, and it tells the whole story of the Brooklyn Brewery, the adventures we had in Brooklyn, the ups and downs, things we did right, things we screwed up. Actually, Mayor Bloomberg wrote a foreword to that book, and he's quite the entrepreneur himself, and I was very proud of that. You may ask, who am I to write a history of craft beer? And that would be a good question. Actually, there's an epigraph before the author's note in the book that quotes Winston Churchill saying, "History shall be kind to me, for I intend to write it." And that's sort of the approach I took with the book. A lot of it is based on my personal experience. I started Brooklyn Brewery in 1988, and I was able to kind of watch the development of this industry close up. I've been involved with the Brewers Association, our trade association, from the beginning, and it just amazed me to see what was happening with individuals coming from all different walks of life with a passion for beer, starting companies, and then actually coming together through our association to really shape the industry that we were involved in. The book begins with the ultimate pioneer of the craft beer revolution, which is Fritz Maytag, obviously a member, a scion of the Maytag washing machine family, who bought the Anchor Brewery in San Francisco in 1965. That was a failing local brewery with a very distinctive brewing style that made a beer called steam beer, which is actually a beer made with the lager yeast but fermented at warmer temperatures like an ale. So Fritz kind of bought that brewery on a whim and set about reconstructing it and building one of the most beautiful breweries, I think, in the world, and also dedicating himself to bringing back that all-malt beer called Anchor Steam. He was alone in doing this until 1976, when a guy named Jack McAuliffe, who had been a U.S. Navy submariner based in Scotland and had gotten into homebrewing when he was over there. And also, this would have been in like the mid-70s when the campaign for real ale was happening in England. And so Jack came back to California to Sonoma and cobbled together a brewery called New Albion using old soda tanks, Pepsi tanks, 55-gallon tanks, and dairy tanks to make this brewery. And actually, he had two co-founders with him, Susie Dennison and Jane Zimmerman. And I interviewed Susie for the book. She's 80 years old now, but had just returned from a tour of Europe with her niece. And she and Jane do a lot of traveling together. Actually, she told me that she and Jane did a lot of the brewing after New Albion got up and running, that Jack kind of left the brewing to them, which is interesting if you think about in the days before the commercialization of brewing, a lot of the brewing was done in the home by women. So I think it's interesting that those two women were kind of there at the foundation of the craft beer revolution. That project, New Albion, was kind of doomed from the beginning. I mean, it was too small, and the whole idea of craft beer was too new at that time to really have any kind of chance. But they struggled along for about 6 years before the whole thing went out of business. It was an important 6 years, though, because there were other members of what I call the pioneer group, people who started before 1984 building craft breweries. So Ken Grossman from Sierra Nevada visited Jack and the brewery at New Albion. Paul Shipman, the guy who Caleb mentioned from Red Hook, he came there. The guy from Goose Island in Chicago, people from all over the country who were interested in starting breweries came to see what was happening at New Albion. And a number of breweries started up as a result of that. I think you know Sierra Nevada. Ken had a bicycle repair shop and later a homebrew shop before he started Sierra Nevada in his garage. Ken is an amazing engineer and tinkerer. And to this day, the new brewery he's building now in North Carolina, he's there every day, very much involved with the engineering of that project. Caleb mentioned Red Hook, and there's a great story about Red Hook in the book, which I think describes some of the struggle of being a pioneer with craft beer back in the early 80s. Paul Shipman was determined he was going to do a very original beer. So he didn't want to buy a brewer's yeast from any of the companies that have yeast libraries where you can buy different kinds of yeast for different styles. He wanted an original yeast, so he went to a chemist at the University of Washington and got a yeast from him to make Red Hook Ale. I guess he agreed with a local publican to launch the Red Hook Ale on a certain date. And the date came for the launch, and they realized the beer didn't really taste very good, but they were kind of stuck because they had put out in the press that they were going to open on this date. So they had their grand opening, with the mayor and all dignitaries, and they tapped the keg, poured the beer, and everyone took a sip and kind of put a good face on it, but they knew, this stuff doesn't taste good. And it was actually left to a reporter for the Seattle newspaper to say what everyone was thinking, which is, this beer tastes like rotten bananas. He called it banana beer. But, they kind of soldiered on. I mean, this was all new territory, and who knew what craft beer was supposed to taste like. So they soldiered on with this bad tasting banana beer for about a year. And people bought it because they wanted to give a local brewer a chance. They were thrilled that there was going to be a new brewery in Seattle. People bought the beer, But after about a year, word was getting back that, people will order this in the pub, but they'll kind of choke down one pint and then they'll switch to, Bud, Coors, or Miller because they couldn't get much beyond a pint. And then a guy came to Seattle who's very important for the craft beer revolution. I'm sure many of you know the name Michael Jackson, a British beer writer who wrote a really important book called The World Guide to Beer, published in 1977. And it was really the first ever, I think, in history, serious history of brewing and of how the different styles developed. And Michael, over his lifetime, which unfortunately ended at age 65, he was also the world's authority on single malt Scotch. And, he swallowed the Scotch and the beer. So his life ended rather early. But Michael visited all those breweries. So he came to Red Hook, and he tasted the Red Hook Ale. And Michael never said anything bad about any craft brewery. I mean, if he didn't like the brewery, he just wouldn't write about it. So he tasted it, and he said, well, this is kind of like Belgian beer. And Shipman said, exactly, Michael, it's a Belgian-style beer. And he changed all the copy on the label to say it's a Belgian-style beer, and they changed all their marketing materials. And, they forged ahead. But still, no matter what you called it, it didn't taste good. And then another guy who's really important for the history of craft beer, came to Seattle, a brewing chemist named Joe Oates, Dr. Joe Oates. And Joe had been the technical director at the Rheingold Brewery in Brooklyn, and he developed light beer. He developed the first ever low-calorie beer in the 60s. Unfortunately, the marketing department decided to call it Gablingers, and it totally flopped. I mean, no one really understood what it was all about. And it really wasn't until Miller Lite, years later, popularized light beer with, those less filling, more flavor commercials, which actually many of your generation may not remember. But anyway, it was a while before light beer took off. And Joe actually advised many other craft brewers. But when he came to Seattle, Joe's a very blunt guy, German, and very sure of himself. So Joe tasted the Red Hook Ale, and he turned to Shipman and said, "Is this made for some sort of ethnic group here in Seattle?" And Shipman said, "No, Joe, it's our Belgian-style ale." And Oates looked at him and said, "No, it's not. It's infected." He said, "This beer has a bacteria in it." So Joe gave them a number of a yeast to buy from the Siebel Institute in Chicago, which Shipman did. And then they produced a new beer called Ballard Bitter. And, Red Hook was on their way to success. I love that story because I think it really illustrates how clueless, the small brewers were back in the day. Joe Oates went on to create a beer in New York City called New Amsterdam Amber for one of the pioneers named Matthew Reich, who was the first contract brewer. Matthew brewed his beer in upstate New York and sold it in New York City. Unfortunately, he couldn't wait to open a brewery in New York City, and he did that on 11th Avenue and 26th Street. And if you know anything about New York City, particularly like back in the mid-'80s, that neighborhood was better known for hookers than for a brewery with a 300-seat restaurant. And he was out of business within a year after building that brewery. But I learned a lot from watching what happened to Matthew building the brewery prematurely in a bad spot. And so did Jim Cook from Sam Adams. Jim went to school on Matthew, as did I. And actually, Jim ended up hiring 080s to develop the recipe for Sam Adams' Boston Lager. And he also ended up hiring Matthew's brewmaster and assistant brewmaster. And the brewmaster is still with Sam Adams to this day. And the point I'm making is that Jim and Brooklyn Brewery and a lot of other breweries started up after the period of the pioneers. And we learned from the pioneers. That was critical to our developing our businesses and the beers we were selling and you know, how we priced those beers. We learned so much. The same way the later pioneers learned from Fritz and New Albion. You know, things developed pretty quickly in the 80s. There were about 1,000 breweries by like 1994. I call my generation of brewers the first generation as opposed you know, to the pioneers. A lot of people look at the 90s and believe there was a period where craft beer kind of crashed because there were a couple of spectacular failures. Pete's Wicked Ale, which actually started right here in Palo Alto, went up quickly to 400,000 barrels and down almost as quickly when they sold to Gambrinus Company, the importer of Corona beer. And Catamount in Vermont, one of the pioneering breweries, built a second brewery, but then stopped growing. So one thing you learn in manufacturing is if you build a brewery, you must pay for that brewery. And if you don't produce beer in that brewery, you're probably not going to be able to pay for the brewery. And I've seen that happen numerous times to different people. But in writing the book, one thing I realized that far from a slump in the 90s, there were actually about 500 breweries started up between 94 and 2000, including some incredibly innovative breweries like Dogfish in Delaware, Allagash up in Maine, Russian River here in California, New Belgium in Colorado. And the difference between those breweries and Brooklyn and the first generation was that they were making Belgian-style beers. First generation, we were kind of stuck on the idea of the German purity law, you know, making beer according to the Reinheitsgebot, using only the 4 basic ingredients of beer. But these breweries that started up in the 90s made all different kinds of styles based on the Belgian styles. And, you know, Sam Calagione in Delaware will put, you know, chocolate mole in his beer. I mean, so far from being a slump, it was actually a whole new push toward innovation in the craft beer movement. You know, the last 10 years have been an incredible growth period for craft beer. It's been double digits for like the last 5 years. And when I started Brooklyn Brewery, you know, people thought I was crazy. You know, people tasted Brooklyn Lager and said, my God, it's so dark and bitter, you know, why don't you make something like Heineken? And I said, well, you know, Heineken makes pretty good Heineken, and I'm doing something different. But really, today, everyone knows what a craft beer is. Back then, people didn't. And those of us in the first generation and second generation really had to educate people in our communities and wherever we were selling beer. I think there are a couple of important reasons for the big growth in the last decade. One might surprise you. It's the big distributors in America have suddenly embraced craft beer in a big way. And part of the reason why they embraced craft beer is because they realized finally it's not a fad, it's not going away. You know, craft beer is now 10% of the US market. Actually, when I started, people said, how are you going to compete with the giant breweries? And I said, well, I'm not going to compete with them. I'm competing with the imports. We're making import quality beer. and we're going to be competing with the German, Belgium, and English imports. At that time, 1988, imports were like 3% of the US market. The other 97% was national brands. Today, 26 years later, imports are like 13% of the US market. Craft beer is 10%. And the two big national brewers, AB InBev and Miller Coors, have been pushed back to 74%. So actually what's happened is better beer, meaning imported beer and craft beer, have pushed into the market share that the big national breweries used to have. And one reason why is because these distributors opened up to craft beer. Until about 10 years ago, the Anheuser-Busch distributors in America were almost exclusively selling Anheuser-Busch products. August Busch III had a policy called 100% share of mind, in which he gave financial incentives to distributors to only sell Anheuser-Busch products. About 10 years ago, the Anheuser-Busch distributors saw what was happening with craft beer and saw the slowdown in the big national brands and opened their doors to craft brewers. That chapter in the book is called Jailbreak, and it's about the AB distributors saying, okay, you can keep your financial incentives. We got to get into this category because we're getting killed by the Miller Coors distributors that are handling craft beer. And that was a huge change. Before that, when a craft brewer would go to a distributor would say, okay, you know, we'll take this Brooklyn stuff, but you have to sell it. We'll deliver it. You have to sell it. So we would go in basically to a distributor on our knees doing a presentation, begging them to take our beer. Today, when we go into a new state, we got the AB distributor, the Miller Coors distributor, probably a craft beer distributor and a wine distributor begging us to come with them because the large brewers have lost an astounding volume of beer just in the last 5 years. They've dropped 18 million barrels of beer. You know, the whole craft segment is about 16 million barrels. So things are really changing rapidly now. And I think one reason why they are changing is because, you know, we've been at this for 50 years, if you go back to the beginning with Fritz. Another big factor is social media. The internet happened at the perfect moment for craft brewers, and a bad moment for the big brewers. You know, their domination was really based on controlling the media through, you know, the three big networks. They could talk to everyone in America with their beer commercials and jingles. All that's gone now. You know, the media, I don't have to tell you guys, has splintered. And you can start a little brewery now in the middle of nowhere and reach everyone you want to reach within a matter of days for free. And that's like a sea change in the way beer gets marketed. And even if you're a brewer who doesn't know anything about social media, the beer enthusiasts who write about beer and blog about beer, they will find you and they will tell the world about you. So that's another huge reason for this big change. Another change is our association, the Brewers Association. You know, from like the 1980s, I've been going to the Great American Beer Festival and the Craft Brewers Conference. Back in the 80s, we were thrilled if there were like 300 people at the Craft Brewers Conference. This year, the conference in Denver, there were between 9,000 and 10,000 people at the conference. I had to work to find my friends. And through that association and those gatherings every year, I've learned so much from my colleagues around the country. I have friends all over the country now who, you know, I've grown up with them in this business. We've learned from each other and we've exchanged ideas, and there's a wonderful community of craft brewers, which is just an incredible advantage for our segment. And our Brewers Association, actually the budget now is $20 million a year. And we're regulated by the federal government and all the state governments. So you've got to have a strong seat at the table to ensure that the laws that are passed are favorable to our segment. The last chapters of the book are about the next generation of brewers. I call them the third generation. And it's amazing to me. There are so many different business models developing. People starting little breweries that their only ambition is to be the brewer in their community. And if the laws are right and you can have a little tap room, you can make a pretty good living with something like that. I profile the Kodiak Island Brewing Company in Kodiak Island, Alaska, which is out toward the Aleutians. I think there are more bears on Kodiak Island than there are people. There are like 14,000 people, I think. But Ben Milstein and his wife run this brewery, and they have a tap room. And it has become like the social center of Kodiak Island, and they couldn't be happier with what they're doing. There are also gypsy brewers today, which is people who are passionate about beer, have recipes for beer, which they get produced by contract brewers. There's a lot of that going on around the country. The craft brewers are incredibly innovative. There's a brewery in Texas. You can't have a brewery restaurant. So there are some guys in Houston who started a brewery called the Eighth Wonder Brewery. And then they started a food truck. And they park the food truck in front of the brewery, and people buy food and walk into the brewery and buy beer. There are also a couple of contract breweries, one in Connecticut and one in Florida, producing beer for a lot of the gypsy brewers. The one in Florida was started by guys who were let go by Anheuser-Busch when they got bought by InBev a few years ago. So it's pretty incredible what's happening. There are now 2,800 breweries across America. There are another 2,000 on the drawing boards. And I think there are going to be winners in all different categories. Different business models, different styles of beer, different focus for the beers that are being made. It's incredibly exciting, and it's becoming a huge business, and I'm very proud to have been part of that. At the beginning, did I tell you how that I used to be a journalist and all that? I thought I forgot that. So I started Brooklyn Brewery in 1987, really. We didn't sell beer till '88, but I used to be a journalist. I started out of college. I had a degree in English. I tried teaching. I almost had a nervous breakdown. It's the hardest thing I ever did in my life. And so I went to work for the local newspaper in upstate New York. And then I worked for small newspapers around New York City. I got my big chance for a job with the Associated Press in Newark, New Jersey in 1976. And for reasons I usually go into after I've had about 4 beers, I got it in my head I wanted to cover a war. And if you work for AP, you can do that. So I started studying Arabic and said I wanted to go to Beirut. And I learned there aren't too many people who want to go to Beirut and cover wars. So like a year after I raised my hand, I landed in Beirut as the Middle East correspondent for AP. That was February 1979. Within a few months, I was in Iran covering the revolution and the hostage crisis. For you youngsters here, that's the movie Argo, and then I got kicked out of Iran by the government. I went back in with the Iraqi army when they invaded Iran in 1980. I covered that war from the Iraqi side. I lived in Beirut, which was crazy with the civil war going on. Actually, I was abducted with the UN patrol in South Lebanon in 1980. Very nasty incident. 2 of the guys with me, Irish UN peacekeepers were tortured and killed. And one guy was shot 5 times. I carried him out, and he lived. Actually, I bet you all know you know Vice Media. Yeah, of course, right? Of course you do. People over 30 don't know anything about Vice Media. Vice Media is actually based right across the street from the brewery in Brooklyn. And I just recently wrote a story for them in January because about a year ago, Homeland Security contacted me, and they said the guy who abducted me in 1980 is living in Detroit running an ice cream truck. He's the good humor man. So I said, you're kidding. And they said, he's applied for U.S. citizenship, and they want me to testify against him. And I said, absolutely. And it's a long story, and take a look at it. It's on Vice. You click the magazine and put my name in, and you'll find the story. But I haven't had to testify yet, so I don't know what's going to happen. You'll see it's a complicated story. Actually, Rupert Murdoch invested $70 million in Vice for 5%. I mean, it's really remarkable. And the guys at Vice told me that Google is about to do the same thing. But I don't know if anyone knows anything about that. But Google's buying everything, I think. That was my background. I covered the Israeli invasion, the massacres in the refugee camps. I moved to Cairo. I was sitting behind President Sadat when he was killed at the parade. So, this was all great training for starting a brewery in Brooklyn and for eventually writing a couple of books, one about Brooklyn Brewery and one about the craft beer revolution. So thank you very much for your attention. And I'm surprised there aren't more women here. I always say that at events at the brewery, we get half women and half men. Maybe it's Monday and the beer, I don't know, but it's good to see the women, and thank you all for coming out, and I'm happy to answer some questions.
So if you guys have questions, I'm going to ask you to use the mic.
What's your take on craft brewers selling out to larger distributors, for instance, Goose Island?
Selling out to big brewers, yeah. I think it's kind of inevitable. I mean, Goose Island, actually just last week I did an event in Chicago with John Hall, the founder of Goose Island. John he was 70 years old when he sold out. His son wasn't interested in staying in the company, so, what are you going to do? John's my friend, I accept it, but Goose Island is now totally controlled by Anheuser-Busch, and that makes them the enemy, to put it bluntly.
I have a question for you, Steve. You said there were about 2,800 breweries in operation now and about 2,000 on the drawing board.
Yeah.
Does that seem like we're going to fill up, like that's almost too many breweries? It's hard to imagine almost 2/3 more than now and still having space for everyone.
Yeah, good question. I don't think so. The way the segment is growing, I think we're behind in keeping up with the demand. And before Prohibition, there were 2,000 breweries in America, and the population was about 40 or 50 million. Today, there are 325 million people in America. I think we can handle 5,000 breweries. So I don't think that's a problem. The problem is going to be, we've been, this word, but we've been very disruptive to the American beer industry. We butted heads with the big guys. We butted heads with the distributors. There are laws in place that are very unfavorable to us. We're going to be butting heads with the distributors and the big guys on a lot of issues. And I'm excited about that. I think it's going to be great fun. But it is disruptive, and there's going to be more disruption, I believe.
I I noticed that you started to distribute Brooklyn Brewery beer internationally. I was wondering if you have like a specific strategy for how you want to start exporting it, because I'm sure that there's a lot of different ways it can go. And also if you feel like it's helpful to sort of leverage how popular like Brooklyn even has become as a brand, because I feel like it has international recognition at this point too.
Yeah, great question. We're in New York City, so a lot of foreigners come to New York City, tourists and business people, and we've had opportunities to export from the very beginning. Actually, we started selling beer in Japan in 1988, our first year in business, and we didn't have a strategy, but our rule was, if you want us to ship you beer in Tokyo or London or Australia, you pay us first and then we'll ship the beer. It was pretty simple. Over the years, we've gotten better and better quality importers to bring our beer into different markets. Our partner right now in Scandinavia is Carlsberg, the number 4 brewer in the world. And actually, we just opened a brewery in Stockholm called the New Carnegie Brewery with Carlsberg. And please go to visit if you're there. It's really cool. And we operate the brewery. We have a subsidiary called Brooklyn, Sweden. We hired the brewers, we hired the chef, and it's right on the water. There's a free ferry that goes to it. And we're going to be announcing a project like that in Asia in the next week or 10 days. And I think we're going to have a lot of opportunities to export. About 30% of our production, which was 220,000 barrels last year, about 30% is export. And I think in the next decade, exports are going to be at least 50% of our sales. We sell in 26 states, and because of this export business, which is good, solid business, we don't discount to export. We make good margin on that. For that reason, we're growing at like 25%, and we see no hurry to try to come to the West Coast because of the good fortune we're having heading east. And anyway, all the West Coast brewers are already in the East Coast, as you may know, and now building breweries in the East Coast. Yes, the name Brooklyn has been amazing for us. And it's funny because when I started, a lot of people questioned naming the beer Brooklyn. They said, geez, the image is not so great, including people who, like lifelong Brooklyners questioned it. And I said, no, I think Brooklyn's a great name. So many immigrants go through here, and people have weird connections to Brooklyn. Now there are like 100 companies in Brooklyn that have consumer products with the name Brooklyn. Actually, I got to give a lot of credit for that name to my designer, Milton Glaser. He's the guy who did the I Love New York logo. Actually, they call him the father of American graphic design. Milton's an amazing guy. In the beginning, I wanted to call the beer Brooklyn Eagle beer, after the old Brooklyn Eagle newspaper edited by Walt Whitman, because, I used to be a newspaper man. And in my first meeting with Milton, I told him what I wanted to call it, and I told him, I want the Brooklyn Bridge, and I want the Dodgers, and I want all this stuff, and he said, well, look, we got Brooklyn here. Forget the Eagle. Who needs an Eagle when you got Brooklyn? We call it Brooklyn beer. It fits, Brooklyn fits with beer. And, he came up with our iconic B logo, which, it's brilliant. I have to admit, the first time I saw it, I looked at it and said, is that it? And Milton said, look, don't say a word, take it home, put it on your kitchen table, show it to your wife. Don't show it to a lot of people, just live with it. And I did that, and, it sunk in. This is a beautiful, simple image and a great image for a brewery. So we love Brooklyn. And the Nets won yesterday. So. Yes?
So this is sort of the flip side of that same question. about like drinking locally. I mean, we've seen the rise of the local food movement over this same period, and I guess the question is, does local beer go with local food? I haven't seen that always connected necessarily, but is that part of the movement or not?
It definitely is part of what's going on. I think it's part of what's happening in a lot of food categories. But with beer, people want to try different things. So, we sell most of our beer in New York City. Actually, our second biggest market is Sweden. If you can believe that. It's a little bigger than New Jersey for us. I feel that we have some unique beers. Actually, the two you're tasting today, Brooklyn Sriracha Ace, is made with the hop that was developed in northern Japan, now grown in Washington State. Anything but local, but it's a beer that is very special for us. Actually, we're coming out with a low alcohol version of that called Brooklyn 1/2 Ale. Later this year. So yeah, part of it is about local, but it's also about exploring different beers and from different places. And so I think there's a place for both. Actually, it's very difficult to do a strictly local beer. We have one beer called Brooklyn Green Market Wheat Beer that we do with the not-for-profit that runs the 53 farmers markets in New York City. And that beer is made with 100% grain grown within like 200 miles of New York City, 70% in New York State, and the other 30%, I think, in Massachusetts. But it's very limited because the production of grain is very limited. So, if you look at people who are touting local, often you'll find their ingredients are coming from all over the world. So it'll be a while before I think strictly local beers are available. And we will be making one when they are available, I can assure you.
When the tables turn on your conversation with the bigger distributors and they're knocking at your door instead of vice versa, did that change your strategy on how you ran the brewery, how you brewed different beers? Did you take bigger chances knowing that you have this into these other distribution paths and channels?
Did it change our strategy? Well, it certainly increased our sales when the big wholesalers opened up. We were a little more confident. We just did like a $12 million expansion in Brooklyn. And, knowing that we had first-rate wholesalers handling our beer made that a much more comfortable decision. Our best-selling beer is still our first beer, Brooklyn Lager. It's about over 50% of our sales. The other 50% is a whole range of different beers, the special kind of beers you have here, regular seasonal beers like Oktoberfest, Pumpkin Ale, and Summer Ale, and that kind of thing. But part of the challenge in managing distributors now is teaching them to handle a very complex portfolio. Practically every craft brewery now has a very complex portfolio of brands. And you've got, the game is learning how to present those to the distributor and get into the minds of their salespeople.
You want to tell us something about the beers that we're tasting?
Yeah, the Sriracha Ace is a Saison style, a Belgian style. Our brewmaster, Garrett Oliver, who's written a couple of great books, one called The Brewmaster's Table, and Garrett is also the editor-in-chief of the Oxford Companion to Beer, which is the first ever encyclopedia of beer published by Oxford University Press. When Garrett first tried the Sriracha Ace hop, he immediately in his head said, I got to make a Saison using this hop. And we first made it as a Brewmaster's Reserve, which is every quarter we come up with a new draft beer, and then customers subscribe to that program. So Sriracha Ace was a draft beer like 3 years ago. and it was incredibly popular. So we came out with this bottle-conditioned version of it in the 750. And later this year, we'll come out with a 12-ounce version of that in a 4-pack. The other beer is part of a series we do quarterly called the Brooklyn Quarterly Experiment, and those are barrel-aged beers. So that other beer, I believe, is a version of our Local 2, which is like a Belgian double, and it's got some orange peel in it, and it's been aged in bourbon barrels with a Brettanomyces yeast, which is a wild yeast that gives you kind of funky flavors. But it's not over the top with the funky flavors. It's pretty subtle. Actually, that beer is fantastic with a lot of foods, and so is Sriracha for that matter.
I was wondering if you could go over the style of IPAs. I mean, they kind of epitomize like what craft beer is to a lot of people.
Yeah.
And then Brooklyn Brewery's relationship with hops.
Well, yeah, IPA is the best-selling style of craft beer now. And the West Coast brewers are crazy about hops. I think West Coast people, a lot of them are crazy about hops. East Coast, I mean, Brooklyn Brewery, we're a little more about balance. We're not particularly looking to blow your brains out with the hops. You know, I think Vinny Cilurzo at Russian River was the first guy to do a double IPA. I think a lot of people credited him with that. You know, that's part of the beauty of the craft beer revolution is the different kind of regional styles of beers. We do have an IPA called Brooklyn East India Pale Ale, which Garrett, our brewmaster, developed in 1994. And it's actually extremely balanced. It doesn't come anywhere near to competing in the blow your brains out hop category. We have a beer called Brooklyn Blast, which is a double IPA and also is pretty balanced compared to West Coast. But, you know, vive la différence.
I recently became aware of Dogfish Head's ancient ale line doing crazy things like resurrecting Nordic grog.
Right.
Are there other examples of brewers doing crazy, unique things like this?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of examples. I think, you know, I did this Reddit Ask Me Anything thing the other day. I got like 100, I responded to 146 people in 2 hours. And my favorite call was, or email was from Brazil. And they asked me if I had tried the new ant beer. I said, you mean it has ants in it? And he said, yeah. And I said, no, I haven't, but I got to tell you, it gives me the creeps. We've talked about, I'd like to do, you know, the world's foremost Egyptologist, Dr. Kent Weeks, is a friend of mine. I got to know him when I lived in Egypt years ago. And I've always wanted to do a beer based on the recipes that they found in tombs in Egypt with Kent. But so far we haven't been able to do that. There's also an interesting beer that Rogue has, which this also gives me the creeps. The yeast in that beer is cultured from the brewmaster John Mayer's beard. Doesn't that sound appetizing? I doubt that's going to set the world on fire.
A question about the distributor relationship that you were describing earlier. As you said, like, so the AB and other guys, distributors are now willing to take your stuff, and when you go into a new state with a reputation like Brooklyn has, it makes sense that they're, you know, asking you to come to them. What have you seen? How has that relationship gone for smaller breweries that you've seen starting up more recently? Is there an in with the distributors? Does the three-tier system end up hurting smaller breweries? What do you see in that?
You know, the three-tier system, a feature of the three-tier system is the franchise law. The franchise law has been in the news lately because of Elon Musk trying to sell his Teslas direct to consumers, and some states saying, no, you can't do that in our state. You have to go through a dealer. So that's what a franchise law is. In the beer business, the distributor essentially owns your brand in most states. When you give it to a distributor, it's a captive brand. You can't get it back unless you can prove bad faith dealing on their part, which is very difficult to prove. I understand why that law is in place. It really keeps the distributors independent of the big brewers coming in and essentially, strong-arming them into selling only the big distributors' beers. But it's very unfair, I believe, for small brewers, because if you get with a distributor, say you sign on with a distributor who's like a startup craft beer distributor or a wine distributor, and you grow to a certain level, and they can't really take you beyond that, but you could go beyond that. So it makes it very difficult to go to a bigger distributor, to change distributors. In New York, we got a law passed that says if you're under 3% of a distributor's business and you're under 300,000 barrels in production, you can move to a different distributor. You have to compensate the distributor before you leave, but most new distributors will pay for that kind of deal. So that's called a carve-out of these franchise laws, and I'm hoping we're going to be able to get that in other states. I think it makes the system much more fair. I'm not against franchise laws. I just think for the smallest brewers, you can end up in jail. A distributor takes you on and sits on you so his competitor can't get you, and that's not fair.
So do you feel that the macrobrewers are getting any more successful at breaking into the craft beer market, like with the crafty beers?
There's an index in the back of my book in which I tried to do a chronology of big brewer efforts to play in our category. And I think it's really only in the last 5 years that they've come to believe that this thing is real. It's not going away. But they've been fiddling around with it since the mid-'80s. I think it's a compliment to us that they're playing in our segment. Miller Coors has Blue Moon, AB has Shock Top and Goose Island. They just bought Blue Point Brewery, which is on Long Island, New York, near Brooklyn. So they're playing in the category. It's a compliment, it's a challenge to us. I think it's a real dilemma for them, because the more they introduce people to flavorful beer, if a person is drinking a Blue Moon tonight, craft beer drinkers are I don't like this word, the big guys call them promiscuous. They're not brand loyal, they want to try new things. And I think if they're drinking a Shock Top or a Blue Moon or a Goose Island, they're more likely to drink a Brooklyn Lager or one of our beers. So I think it's a very tricky game for the big guys, because the more they promote flavor, the more they undercut their big brands, which are not about flavor. They were about power marketing. That game has all changed now with the splintering of the media and the internet, et cetera. So we'll see what happens. Craft beer is like 10% by volume, about 15, 16% by dollars. I think it's going to be 30% maybe in the next 20 years. And when I say craft beer, I'm only saying based on the Brewers Association definition. If you add in the crafty beers, it gets up above, close to 20% already. Thank you all very much.